Yeah, like I said, just keep on keeping on. So I hope you overcome what we call the pod fade. You don't parang di mo ma-reach yung episode 20 tapos nag-stop ka na because na-discourage ka because of the lack of listeners. It happens. I tell you guys, it happened to me. But just keep releasing episodes consistently. Once you get a listener na maring mag-binge ng lahat ng episodes mo, imagine if you were at your 100th episode and you just got one listener that will binge all that 100 episode. Ang dami ng magiging number of listens mo. So one listener lang yon. So that's why there's value to constantly release an episode. So and always be concerned about the quality of your show, audio wise and content wise. You have the utmost responsibility to the listeners. There are a lot of times that I re-recorded whole episodes because the quality is poor. So make sure you don't regret ever releasing an episode. So make sure you're okay with the quality that you're releasing.
Hi, how are you, Jay? How are you today?
Hi, Miko. Nice to meet you. Thanks for inviting me. How are the listeners of the podcast? How's everyone?
All right. Thank you for that. So, the first question I have for you, Jay, is for our listener and audience,
Mm.
because this is also an audio and video podcast. So,
Mhm.
to our Ito on podcast listener, who is Jay Aruga?
Okay, so I'm the host of the Jay Aruga Show. So it's a very lazy name. I used my name in the title. And I call it the first conservative podcast in the Philippines. I took out the only. Tinanggal ko na yung only kasi may mga ibang seemingly conservative podcast din naman.
Why conservative podcast? What is the overview? Ano yung overview ng Jay Aruga podcast? In a typical episode, what's the overview?
Mm-mm.
What is your main goal
Mhm.
that you
Uh,
created the podcast?
Yeah, the goal of the podcast, the Jay Aruga Show, is to inform the audience of the conservative values. So why we believe what we believe in, which are yun nga, conservative values. And when I say conservative values, this includes the conjugal view of marriage, the importance of fatherhood and motherhood to a family, the promotion of chastity, among others. My other goal is to inspire the audience with the same values as mine to start a podcast as well and be active in creating content because I believe we need more people from the conservative side to spread the message because as it stands, the podcast sphere leans more on the liberal side of the political spectrum. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to silence voices that I don't agree with. But what I'm appealing to for conservatives to do is to jump in because the water's fine. And I'm hoping there would be a balanced number of voices from different beliefs and political spectrum in the podcast sphere.
So, because most of your episodes more on say more on conservative values, on Catholic as well, have you experienced like either a sensory or censored or discrimination or someone tried to threaten you because of the value, the conservative that you are trying to invoke or message through your podcast?
Not on the podcast, and maybe because hindi naman ako popular or famous enough. That's why I'm not being censored like Joe Rogan is being censored right now. So not on the podcast, but I do get some like maanghang na comments in my Facebook page every now and then and in Instagram, and you'd expect that because I'm pushing a bit of I'm talking about sensitive issues, and it's sad, but sometimes in order to speak the truth and for people to think, you have to risk offending some people, according to Dr. Jordan Peterson. So there's a few.
So how do you handle it? So if there's someone have a
Mm.
alam mo naman sa Pinas, there's a lot of
Oo nga.
keyboard troll. or how do you handle this kind of
Uh,
comment?
yeah, sometimes I engage. Sometimes uh, because there are people who are in the middle of the issue, and if they're a listener, I engage. Kasi sometimes may mga troll na ano na parang nagto-troll lang talaga and hindi naman talaga listener. And I try to bait them. Parang I I I mention their name inside the episode para malaman ko kung nakikinig ba sila. Parang pag nag-comment sila, I mention their name in the episode. I kinda give them a shout out. And if hindi sila mag-react in the Facebook page, I would know na parang nanggugulo lang to. This is not really a listener. And there's no reason for me to engage with this person dahil parang hindi naman sila hindi I won't change their mind. But if they're a listener and they're sincerely like looking for answers, I try to engage as much as I can.
Well, that's a good strategy. So, so when is the podcast started
Oh,
for our
so
listener to know?
oh yeah, so it started 2019. So may mga 3 years na yung podcast, and nag-start siya nung senatorial elections noong 2019. And at first I never intended for it to be a conservative podcast. Nag-start lang ako on like discussing about fallacies, how to be open-minded, and sometimes I dwell into philosophical discussions like moral relativism and that sorts. Tapos biglang na-realize ko parang there's there's a need for a conservative podcast because parang nagli-lean on one side lang yung dami ng podcast, especially sa ranking sa Spotify. And I think we need to balance the ideas out there.
What are, say, the 2 or 3 things that biggest impact to you or to your personal brand on your podcast?
The biggest impact, what I think yung when growing the podcast, let's say, di ba, parang you need to come up with a niche talaga. And like I said, I never intended to be a conservative podcast. Pero if you're too broad on being a podcaster, you lose some audience. Dahil parang parang mahirap maging broad sa podcast sphere. So as you go along, you'll realize you'll have a niche. And kung ano talaga yung favorite mo, baka yun yung niche mo. And once you get a niche, you'll gain people from that niche. And the natural thing for you to do is to promote on groups with that niche. So ako, I discovered this conservative movement in the Philippines and medyo bago lang. And I'm happy that meron palang conservative movement sa Philippines, and I was able to join their pages and doon ako nakapag-promote. So that's one thing I think na nakapag-improve ng podcast ko. And may mga nakilala din akong other podcasters that I was able to guest on. And minsan nag-guest ko rin sila sa podcast ko. So those are the things that help my podcast a lot.
Thank you for that, Jay. So, on Southeast Asia, podcasting is a little bit quite new. It's still in infancy. We call that still a blue ocean because some of my client is from Southeast Asia. For a podcaster like you who's doing DIY, so do it yourself, what is your advice for people who is thinking of getting into the podcasting bandwagon?
Okay, so what's my advice? The problem sometimes with podcasting, because anyone could start a podcast, and the problem with that is people get easily demoralized when they start their podcast. So I saw this graph before wherein when you release a podcast, your first episode has high like number of listens because you'll invite your friends, your family to listen, and then the graph goes down. And most of the podcasters, they don't reach episode 20 because they get demoralized. they get demotivated. And believe me, it happened to me as well. I know the feeling. There were times when I contemplated if I should continue my podcast because I experienced the low numbers too. When you see the graph, and it happens to many podcasts, part of the graph is that you see the growth slowly. You see your podcast slowly going up because once you weed out your friends and family who only listened to your podcast in episode 1 because you forced them to, you some of the listeners will come in if you release episodes consistently. So I think that's my tip for those who want to jump into the podcast sphere. uh, just release an episode consistently, improve your work and the quality of your show. So find the right places in the internet to promote your podcast, and the number of audience will surely grow. And I'm blessed, like I said, to be friends with other podcasters who shared tips to me and helped me grow my podcast. And I'm also blessed to meet people in my niche and people who guested me and who I guested to grow my podcast.
Thank you. Sabi nga is riches on the niches. So,
Tama, tama.
so what keeps you inspired and motivate day to day? So, on in relation to your podcast as well, do you if you're doing a season by season,
Mm,
are you planning ahead for the next
mm,
season? Or what keeps you going?
mm. So what keeps me going is my advocacy because I'm determined to spread the word, the reason why I believe in the values I believe in. So I would like to inform people, more people, why I believe what I believe in. So in my podcast, I talked about secular reasons for marriage, why marriage should be permanent. So I talk about secular reasons. I also talk about the, let's say, the side effects of contraceptives, and this is not being discussed much in the internet. So I try to give information that not many people know of. So my main goal also is, like I said earlier, to influence other conservatives to be podcasters too. And once I achieve that, maybe I could hang the mantle of Jay Aruga and just relax and maybe stop podcasting. But it's still far from that. The goal is still far from being achieved.
So, what on doing your podcast? What typical tools or workflow are you doing when you start planning an episode?
Mm. Uh, the workflow when I'm thinking of an episode, sometimes you can't plan in advance too much because sometimes uh, the idea or an episode gets old fast. Like when you're like last week's news seems like last year's news, di ba? Parang kunwari, if something happens this week, next week parang ang tagal na ng pangyayari na yan. So you can't plan in advance too much. With that said, I think you can still list down topics that are at least timeless. So you need to list down topics that are timeless. Na when you record in advance, hindi siya naluluma. And then for the tools, I invested in Hindenburg Pro. So it's a bit expensive. So it's the software I used to record my podcast. But maybe that motivated me as well to continue podcasting, to not stop before episode 20 para masulit. Aside from that, I started using a condenser mic, an ATR 2500 when I started my podcast. But I realized that a condenser mic requires absolute silence from the surroundings, which I can't afford because my family is too noisy. So I switched to a dynamic mic, Samsung Q2U, recommended by Jeric Defante of Langaspix podcast. So aside from that, I use this Jabra headphones. But my tip is just invest in a good mic sa mga magsisimula mag-podcast because it enhances the quality big time, the audio quality.
So, being one of the conservative podcasts in the Philippines, how hard is that to you?
Mm. Uh, it, at first it's a bit hard kasi no, when I started branding my podcast as conservative, akala ko no one would listen because I don't think there are a lot of conservatives who are into podcast. But when I found the groups, eh, I need to I need a lot of people to I need to convince a lot of people to start listening to podcast. Kasi yung mga conservatives pala dito sa Pilipinas, especially yung mga Christians, mga Catholics, hindi pala sila into podcast. And mostly yung mga people into podcast are those who want to listen to like sex stories or those sexcapades, and hindi sila conservative. And at first I was scared na na walang makikinig sa akin and baka mabash pa nga ako. So part of my growth strategy is to invite more people, lalo na sa mga Christian and Catholic circles, to start listening to podcast. And I hope nakatulong din sa mga ibang podcasters yon, because I'm bringing in more people in this sphere, in this medium.
That's great. So you're starting a community of
Mm.
conservative that can listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
So who has been your role model when you doing this podcast?
Okay, so my favorite conservative podcaster is Matt Walsh. So sa Daily Wire sa US, and sina Ben Shapiro din. I'm very into Dr. Jordan Peterson. He is not conservative per se, but ang talino niya, and he's my parang dream guest in my podcast, si Dr. Jordan Peterson. So I'm inspired by them, yung mga nasa what you call the intellectual dark web. I'm not saying na intellectual yung podcast ko, but I hope I'm getting there. I try to be. So nagpre-pretend lang ako maging intellectual.